Welcome everyone to Historians on Planetary Futures, a 2022 seminar series seeking to broach new histories of the planet and its future that explore the nature of spatial, temporal, and disciplinary boundaries, the connections between politics, humans, and Earth processes, and the traditions, opportunities, and difficulties of thinking about the future. Before we start in earnest, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Bedegal country and pay my respects to Bedegal elders past and present. I'd also like to extend my respects to all First Nations people of the place now called Australia, and I acknowledge that First Nations sovereignty here was never ceded. Today we're hearing from Dr. James Dunk, Research Fellow in the Department of History at the University of Sydney, who is presenting Safe Operating Space, Limits, Boundaries and Psychology on a Small Planet. Dr. Dunk is a historian of science and medicine and the environment. His research explores the way that psychology and health sciences have responded to ecological crises since the mid-20th century. His book, Bedlam at Botany Bay, won the Australian History Prize at the New South Wales Premier History Awards, and his articles have appeared in History of Psychology, Rethinking History, History Australia, and the New England Journal of Medicine. His writing on the environment, mental health, and history also appears in Griffith Review and the Australian Book Review. Thank you very much, Jamie, for being the first to present in this series in 2022. And I'll invite you now to give your talk.
Thank you, Jared, and thanks to Alison and to the Centre for hosting. This is a wonderful series. I'm so happy to be part of it and addressing you today. I want to start by also acknowledging the traditional elders and owners of the land on which I am living and working, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And to also just point out and agree that sovereignty has never been ceded. Under that is the condition in which we all work and think. I wanted to show you the planetary boundaries diagram, but I hope that enough of you are familiar with it, and I'm going to describe it anyway. It's the planetary boundaries diagram, first developed in 2009, is a sort of undisciplined exploded pie chart. In one iteration, a gentle green core is superimposed on a spherical projection of the globe. Its center somewhere in Panama, and deep red highlights thrusting segments out across the circumference of the world. Climate change, biosphere integrity, freshwater use, ocean acidification, ozone depletion, all tracking recklessly towards what is marked in other iterations as increasing risk. A line is drawn crosswise through each segment, around the core and close to it. This is the threshold of stability. Below and within it lies what the authors of the concept call this safe operating space for humanity. University of Oxford economist Kate Raworth has adapted the framework by mapping social needs inside these planetary boundaries. Below the outer threshold of stability is plotted an inner ring representing the minimum requirements for human well-being: housing, water, energy, peace, justice. These diagrams present new visions of planet Earth, not spinning lonely through the heavens or a distant glimmer in a satellite's careless backward glance, but a planet segmented and squeezed by the needs and effects of a dominant species. It's a constrained, limited vision of the human species in its planetary environment, suspended between the life support systems to which the planet is reduced, a medical analogy which makes one of the three organizing concepts of the planetary boundaries framework, the life support systems, and its basic redistributed demands. Between social and planetary boundaries, writes Raworth, between social floor and ecological ceiling, lies an environmentally safe and socially just space in which humanity can thrive. These diagrams are recent expressions of a foundational discourse in environmental governance. It began with dire predictions about survival and collapse in the 1940s and continued to manifest in post-war debates about limited national and global supplies of key minerals and metals. In the early 70s, the limits discourse reached a high point in the very famous first report of the Club of Rome, a planetary management think tank that emerged from the epicenter of the curation of global post-war economic growth, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. This report, Limits to Growth, projected a range of interdependent variables in various scenarios to discover that neither economic nor population growth could continue indefinitely on a finite planet. The report was at once enormously successful, selling 30 million copies in over 30 languages, becoming the best-selling book on the environment of all time, and much maligned, producing a powerful backlash amongst economists, industry leaders, and policymakers who remain committed to the growth is good mantra of the post-war period. 20, 30, and 40-year updates to the report mark the contours of this limits discourse. So this paper is situated in the midst of that limits debate, which I here interpret as the expression of a certain spatial logic written into forms of environmental governance, a logic that the planetary boundaries would inherit. Here are a set of theoretical numerical limits, represented as defining a safe space. But the limits, though supposedly physical, geological, geochemical, were far from neutral or indisputable. Instead, the limits were uncertain quantities constructed as instruments to be operated in a dialectic with the warnings issued by ecologists and environmental scientists. A line which must never be crossed, a trajectory which must be shifted because of its relationship with an uncrossable line, intangible but apparently deadly thresholds. I analyze here an important departure from this dialectic at the time of the first update, the first 20-year update of the original report, which was written by 3 of the 4 original authors. The human economy was already at that point in overshoot, they warned in stark words. The human world was beyond its limits. My interest here is to show how their project led the authors, particularly lead author and key member Donella Meadows, who was widely known as Dana, to look beyond their data and to ask what might explain the continuing lurch of human societies towards collapse, societies that had been warned. I explore how concerns about collapse and survival helped produce a radical revision of that spatial logic that had underwritten much of the debate around ecological disruption, focusing on a presentation which Meadows gave at the Center for Psychology and Social Change in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in April 1992. Beyond the Limits, it was called, The Environment's Challenge to the Human Psyche. Those who took up Meadows' challenge suggested that the critical limits for the planetary environment were not external to humans and societies, but deep within each person, the intangible internal boundary which had long been erected around the human psyche, separating humans philosophically, spiritually, materially from other species. Meadows demonstrated an escape from the dance between information and decision, warning and limit, circling around a place of final darkness. Though it helped illuminate and energize the new field of ecopsychology, it was an escape trajectory largely untaken, as environmental discourse largely returned to limits, boundaries, and donut economics and diagrams, with humans imagining ourselves, when pressed, as acting and making policy within a set of external limits, and that if we pull enough levers, we might navigate between social floor and ecological ceiling and be safe. Man is becoming aware of the limits of his Earth, wrote New York-based conservationist Henry Fairfield Osborne Jr. at the heart of the first Cold War. Democracy and liberty flourished where there was well-being, but communism, he warned, entered where there was protracted want. The problem, as he'd written in his first book, Our Plundered Planet, was that the Earth was constantly becoming smaller, or rather our knowledge of it is leading us to think of it as diminishing rapidly. Beneath and beyond the Cold War, he wrote, lay man's continuing conflict with nature. The species now had to cast its gaze into the reaches of both time and space, into the past as into far places, in order to see the planetary predicament. It was the hour of decision, he wrote. For now, as we look, we can see the limits of the Earth. In the post-war period, however, the protracted global conflict between democracy and communism eclipsed these portents of finitude. To revive a majority world economy limping out of 3 decades of war and recession, Western powers pursued a program of general economic growth. It was phenomenally successful in many ways, but as the masses consumed their way to economic and political safety, some looked to the social and environmental indexes of what they were doing. Alexander King, head of the science branch of the OECD, which was a main engine of this growth, saw rising economic inequality, social unrest of student revolts and alternative movements, a deleterious technological dependency developing, and finally, profound environmental ruination. Together with anti-fascist industrialist Aurelio Picai, King founded the Club of Rome in 1968 to study what they saw as the global problematique, the predicament, global predicament. By 1970, the 75 members of the club drawn from industry and bureaucracy throughout the Western world, had broken the general predicament down into 66 interrelated continuous critical problems, ranging from poverty and crime to resource depletion, terrorism, and racism. They invited MIT computer engineer and systems scientist Jay Forrester to discuss these things. He explained how system dynamics and computer processing power could analyze and integrate these complex, interrelated concerns to simulate a series of growth scenarios. He passed the project to a team led out of MIT by Dennis Meadows, called the Club of Rome Project on Predicament of Mankind at MIT. It adapted Forrester's work to build the World 3 model, which integrated information about 5 key trends: industrialization, population growth, malnutrition, resource depletion, and environmental deterioration, all over a 100-year timeframe. After 8 months, they presented preliminary findings at a meeting at Montebello, a grand house outside Ottawa. Addressing the meeting, Forrester concluded that there was a primary cause behind these continuous critical problems. It is growth, he said. The exponential growth of energy use, material flows, and population against the Earth's physical limits. Growth, which many saw as the solution to global problems, was in fact the cause of a new and deepening many-faced predicament. The physical limitations of the Earth indicated limits to this expansion of the economy. We don't know where they are, Forrester said, but we do know that on a finite planet, limits are inevitable. One limit might be evaded, but another would appear. Our only option, he said, is to choose our own limits, or let nature choose them for us. Shortly after Montebello, the MIT team published their findings. Imperfect, oversimplified, and unfinished, though they said their work was, their findings were so fundamental and general that they considered that they would not be substantially changed by further work. They were fairly simple. Business as usual first would see limits of growth reached within 100 years, leading to sudden decline in population and manufacturing. Secondly, it was possible to substitute for these trends an ecological and economic stability, leading to a global equilibrium, in which all basic human needs were satisfied and each person has an equal opportunity to realize his or her individual human potential. And thirdly, timing mattered. Early action would mean achieving equilibrium at a lower cost. The authors cited the complex long-term problems confronting the human world: the nuclear arms race, population explosion, an implicit reference to the biologist Paul Ehrlich, who saw humans exploding like a biological weapon across the 20th century stage, economic stagnation, environmental degradation. They saw policies being pursued which were inconsistent with these fundamental findings. And they suggested that earlier warnings in the same vein, like those of Fairfield Osborne, had fallen on deaf ears because the bulk of human energies were spent solving narrow, local problems. And there were dangers in limiting one's view to an area that is too small, they said. Information was limited, perspectives too narrow. This applied as much to world leaders and their electoral concerns as to individuals caught up in their local problems. All were working with a limited set of data because of their limited visions of the world. And they imposed an interlinked set of limited criteria for success and failure. This was a self-defeating configuration, since most personal and national objectives may ultimately be frustrated by long-term global trends, they said. As Dana Meadows would later recall, the authors saw Forrester's world model as a way to expand these narrow mental models in which they saw their contemporaries trapped. The power of computers. Limits to growth therefore formed part of the broader emphasis in post-war environmental discourse on finitude. From Osborne's small, plundered and limited Earth to William Voigt's Road to Survival, some looked beneath the boom and splurge of these years to see a drawing close of possibility and narrowing of horizons. The population bomb, the spaceship Earth, the closing circle, Barry Commoner's text that made virtue out of necessity. The landmark report for the landmark UN conference on the human environment in 1972 in Stockholm was called Only One Earth, the care and maintenance of a small planet. Systems dynamics did indeed help to illuminate the trajectory of these growth mechanisms that concerned ecologists and economists and the Club of Rome founders alike. Translated into 30 languages, selling better even than Carson's Silent Spring, the book drew general worldwide attention to finitude. And yet, the more successfully these limits were described, the more powerfully they entered into popular imaginations, the closer they seemed to draw around human species, constricting and strangling and suffocating. The book was interpreted by many as a prediction of doom, the authors reflected. But it was not a prediction at all. It was not about a preordained future. It was an educational tool, providing the information which individuals and governments needed to set appropriate economic and environmental policies and to elect representatives to enact them so that the trajectories of human societies could inflect away from collapse. It was about a choice, they wrote. It contained a warning, to be sure, but also a message of promise. Some looked for a more palatable message. The World Commission on Environment and Development, led by Norwegian medico and former Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, met through the 80s to consider the shared needs of the world's poor and the small and fragile planet in the same frame of reference. The Brundtland Commission positioned human societies quite carefully. The environment is where we live, wrote the commissioners in the introduction, and development is what we all do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode. The two are inseparable. It was a core distinction drawn between growth and development, trying perhaps to avoid the backlash generated by the doom-riddled discourse of limits and finitude. Growth indicated an increase in size, but development referred to the expansion or realization of potentiality. To develop, they argued, is to bring to a fuller, greater, or better state. It was better to be better than to be bigger. It was also necessary because, as they wrote, our planet develops over time without growing. And so the human economy, a subsystem of the finite and non-growing Earth, must eventually align with the oversystem. Continued growth would send it crashing through the finite ceilings of planetary systems. Part of the work of the Brundtland Commission had been to assess how poorer countries might be assisted to develop and the world population to grow, and energy sources to continue to heat and light these societies which were growing, all of which indicated an increase in global pollution and climate disruption, all while remaining within these planetary limits. It was a question of space also, as Brundtland told the Harvard Alumni Association in June '92. Poorer societies required environmental space for their development. The developed world, represented by those assembled in the room, could hardly say, sorry, we've filled the wastebasket, there's no room left for you. Brundtland was adapting the limits to growth concept, which she cited, to the issues that were gathering around her commission's report, issues hashed out at the commission conference, the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. Developmental justice had to be factored into global environmental governance, and the space between limits did not represent only a supply of resources, sinks, or ecosystem services, as they could be called, but the uneven array of human opportunities and possibilities. Both the limits framework and the Brundtland report aim to provide information and guidance about the physical limits and policy levers of economic growth, and to inspire a deliberate general shift away from the post-war growth mindset. 20 years after the publication of the original report, however, it had become clear that the human world was not, in general, making this choice. In the early 90s, 3 of the 4 limits to growth authors returned to their models, updating data sets and rerunning simulations to check the effect of the new technological improvements and environmental policies introduced in the 70s and 80s. As Dennis Meadows, and Jorgen Randers compiled the data and reran their simulations, however, they found that resource and pollutant flows and population increases had all grown beyond sustainable limits. The human world, they wrote, was beyond its limits. The transgression would lead within decades to a rapid and uncontrolled drop in per capita food output, in available energy and industrial production, unless there was a rapid, drastic improvement in the efficiency of resource and energy use, and a comprehensive global overhaul of the policies that continue to perpetuate material and population growth everywhere. While incredulous and vitriolic discourse amassed around the very idea that there could be limits to human growth, that growth had continued recklessly towards the physical limits of the Earth system. A sustainable society was technically and economically possible, they wrote, but it was now clear that any transition would be very difficult. More than new policies and technologies, the authors saw that achieving sustainability would require maturity, compassion, and wisdom. Over thousands of years, the agricultural and industrial revolutions had placed an enormous and exponentially growing burden on the planet. Now a third and still more profound sustainability revolution was necessary to lift that burden. It would be a revolution of mindset, they wrote, a revolution in our minds. The end of Beyond the Limits clarified the fundamental challenge. Osborne had written 40 years earlier that a book about the human predicament can never actually conclude. Every book calling for change, as Meadows would say, has to offer a detailed program of change. And so we wrote a lot of draft chapters that said, recycle your bottles and cans, buy an efficient automobile, vote for a carbon tax, change the American political system, a few things like that. And all of that is inadequate. Even the original report had recognized that the trends they revealed had implications that went far beyond the proper domain of a purely scientific document, as they said, and that they had to be debated by a wider community than that of scientists alone. And so our purpose here, they said, is to open that debate. But 20 years later, they were more direct. Their own instruments, rational analysis, data, systems thinking, computer modeling, that were in both books were useful, necessary, and not enough. Information was certainly the key to transformation, but their experience over the decades had shown that achieving any transition or revolution would require something more successful, a kind of mediation. After many drafts, the final conclusion of the book outlined 5 strategies at the end, 5 strategies for sustainability. The first is what they called visioning, deploying imagination to tackle problems of apparently insurmountable scale and complexity. Vision, argued these systems dynamics and analysts, brings into being new systems. Second was truth-telling, a sort of combative identification of misinformation. Networking was a third strategy. Fourth was what they called learning, but was really a kind of collaborative, cross-disciplinary. Here they admitted was a bit of a difficulty. Genuine learning required an open mind and unhurried dialogue. But in a condition of overshoot, with possible collapse on the horizon, there is not much time for patience and forgiveness. Effective dialogue and concerted programs of change therefore called for an elusive middle road between, as they said, urgency and patience, accountability and forgiveness. Navigating between these contrasting virtues would require compassion, humility, clear-headedness, and honesty. This led them towards their final tool of revolution, which was love. The very word made them uncomfortable. Perhaps it makes us uncomfortable. One is not allowed in the modern culture to speak of love, they wrote, and yet they saw love as a critical means of negotiating the inevitable projections and anxieties produced by any talk of planetary collapse. Pessimism, they argued, was the deepest cause of unsustainability, and it was built into the foundations of the current social system. It distorted information, wrecked debate, rejected available solutions. The core problem, the problem driving the primary cause of the global predicament, which is growth, was therefore a problem of spirit and soul, a mindset that prevented individuals and policymakers alike from receiving and acting on information to make rational choices for survival. So I want to explore this pivot a little further in the time I have left. Just as Dana Meadows did 40 years ago, during this presentation at the Center for Psychology and Social Change at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. Founded by John Mack in 1982, together with depth psychologist and trauma theorist Robert J. Lifton, the center had begun as a research program in human continuity in the face of the prospect of nuclear annihilation. Its researchers were following the psychological strands of global peril from the nuclear threat into environmental issues as the Cold War began to thaw. It supported projects on national and international environmental governance, on nuclear waste, on decision-making. And at the end of the 80s, there was a series of events featuring deep ecologist Freya Matthews and systems theorist and despair work practitioner Joanna Macy. The following year, Mack, who is now academic director, convened the seminar Psychology as if the whole Earth Mattered. And he presented it alongside a series of speakers who'd all taken alternative routes through psychiatry and psychology, ecology, conservation, nuclear physics, sociology, all to arrive at these same similar psychological questions about the human-Earth relationship and about the propensity to violence and destruction. When Meadows was invited to speak at the Centre in April 1992, she called her talk "The Environment's Challenge to the Human Psyche," an evocative title. 6 months after she had finished and Beyond the Limits with the other authors, this talk was a reflection on the update and the project as a whole. She described how the cycling, it also gave a clearer sense of her own concerns in distinction from those of her co-authors. She described how the cycling of resources from the Earth through the human economy and back to the Earth as pollutants and waste had doubled in the last 20 years, not lessened, but doubled. And it was likely to double again in the next 20. How the human world was already beyond the sustainable limits of extraction and use and wastage. This had only been possible because flaws in scientific warning systems meant that humans had only just become aware of the scale of their influence over planetary systems, now that they'd overshot these limits and systems. And so the outlook was bleak, with a general collapse of human and ecological systems possible within 20 or 50 years. And yet the authors insisted that there was still some hope of the outcomes. Some hope of the outcomes envisioned in the original report and in our common future, the Brundtland Commission. On the eve of the Earth Summit, Meadows described the unswerving goal of the Limits Project as the aversion of global collapse by creating a world that more fully meets human needs and desires. It was, of course, the language of the era-shifting psychologist Abraham Maslow. He was quoted. Understanding human desire was crucial not only to drawing the contours of a sustainable, balanced future society, but to devising strategies to reach it. The original analysis and their recent update had led the team, as Meadows said, to where science ends and the human psyche, culture, heart, and soul have to take over. Limits of growth had done so tentatively and briefly, almost furtively. Beyond the Limits had pressed a little further. I was trained as a physical scientist and as a systems scientist, Meadows told her audience in Cambridge, not as a person with particular knowledge in the humanistic or psychological side of things. We're scientists, she said, as she introduced her thoughts on love as a solution to ecological problems. And we're not used to this kind of talk, and we don't have the language, really, and we're a little embarrassed. She and the team had carried the conversation as far from their models as they could before ceding the project to those with more knowledge on the psychological side. And so that evening in Cambridge, Dana Meadows wanted to explore that territory by posing to this informed, psychologically curious audience these questions, which the findings left her asking. The team had wrestled with how to conclude that book, with various programs of practical change. This was part of the solution, as Meadows said, but that's not really it, and we knew it wasn't really it. We finally, and this is her description of how they ended that book, we finally, after some heated discussion, ended up by calling upon people to be good and wise and generous and humble, far-sighted and enlightened, and so on. Frankly, honestly, I think that's the only way out of this dilemma. Imagine we might really have to be good. Here, there was a little laughter in the audience. How do you make people be good, she said. I don't know. That's what John Mack's going to tell you in a minute. And now there was more laughter as Meadows took her seat. Talk about impossible tasks, Mack muttered as he rose to respond. He was a research psychiatrist, a specialist on children's and political psychology, nightmares, and high-level decision-making. He sketched a brief history of the Western psyche, describing how, from the 17th century on, led by Descartes and Newton, scientific materialism had deliberately separated the human psyche, spirit, or subjective reality from the material and natural world, which in the Baconian tradition is there to be dominated, exploited, and utilized, he said, solely for the purpose of the material gratification of those who can exploit it most fully. This separation was consolidated across Western institutions, disciplines, and governments, which together constituted the obstacles to the revolution of the mind that Meadows and her team had agreed, with some difficulty, was necessary. Now, asked Mack, how does change happen? He told of the first time he met Dana at a conference hosted by the Center for Psychology and Social Change the year prior, where scientists, environmentalists, psychologists, philosophers, economists, community organizers had registered their awareness of the dying planet and discussed strategies for sustainability. Meadows, who was then in the midst of compiling new data and rerunning the simulation models again, had talked about how, while she was collecting the original data for the original report in the early 70s, how she'd seen the implications of her work and began to weep over her statistics. Her talk, all the same, was called Change is Not Doom. That image, Mac said, of a scientist weeping over her statistics is the reaching of the self in its emotional, deeper way. And how do we do that? The information was there in the limits books, in the Brundtland Commission, in the various other solemn warnings from physical science, from earth science and environmental science. We know the reality, said Mac. This is in 1990. We know the reality. We've had that information in the cognitive sense. Change, however, would require that individuals open themselves to this information at a deep level. Taking in models of collapse and overshoot, research that had itself been gained through tears, was an experience, emotional, he said. To move through it to positive action would require experiential work addressing the psychology, the root structures, by entering non-ordinary states of consciousness, perhaps, by eroding the overdeveloped rationalism that had plagued the limits debate and that had accompanied economic development, technological development for centuries. All of this called for a new psychology which did not restrict its gaze to individuals, groups, even relations between self and society, but a deeper and wider psychology, one as if the whole earth mattered. This psychological work began with the confrontation of the separation between Saki and the planet, which is so deep in Western culture, and its manifestation in the work of those institutions where they presented clinically. This was essentially human pain. Whether it's sadness, grief, terror, whatever it is, said Mac, pain is our energy of change here, pain in relation to vision. The revolution would germinate in the individual, taking in this difficult information and experiencing pain and grief and working through it. The transformative psychology would well up across individuals and communities to drive a wide political program of meaningful change across the whole systems of institutions, corporations, government, media. We're talking now, he said, about a massive political movement which has to involve all of us and begins with our own inner journey and pain. 40 years earlier, Fairfield Osborne had appeared to see that the plunder of the planet pointed to a failure in the relationships, I quote, of man with nature as a whole, and more especially with other living things. But as Osborne went on to clarify, the word nature was one of the broadest words in the English language, and his definition led quite far away from the sentient beings of the more than human world we might be thinking. For Osborne, nature was the sum total of conditions and principles which influence, indeed govern, the existence of all living things. To correct the relationship with nature then was to attend to these principles, recalling that nature was the source of life, of our life, he said. From the first pages of Our Plundered Planet, Osborne had written about nature in these terms of resources, non-renewable, mineral resources, but also those derived from animal and plant life, which he called, in the full sense of the term, he said, living resources, not only because they themselves are alive, but also because they provide the foods and fibers that sustain man's own life, as well as a substantial part of his industry and economy. In his next book, The Limits of the Earth, the weight of those lives had faded further from view in favor of their material gifts to humans. The time for defiance was at an end, he wrote on his final page. Nature was to be cooperated with, human demands tempered, and living resources conserved in order to ensure the continuation of human civilization. The metaphor of life support used in the Planetary Boundaries framework, drawn from emergency biomedicine, works in a similar way. The planet and all its species become a cradle for human life. But as social, economic, and ecological feedbacks began to undermine the post-war confidence in growth, human exceptionalism like this began to falter. In his 1981 memoir, the Club of Rome founder, Aurelio Pachai, called for a new humanism, replete with new value systems to redress what he said was our inner balance, and with new ethics and aesthetics to go with it. Such a system, he said, must be capable of restoring within us love, friendship, understanding, solidarity, spirit of sacrifice, conviviality, and it had to reframe gain according to the strength of relations between individuals and between species. This is an industrialist. Meanwhile, humans were destroying their own habitat, as Yale human ecologist Paul Shepard wrote in his 1982 book, Nature and Madness. To understand the cause of this biologically quite unique and bizarre behavior, he reached far back into deep time and to present indigenous societies to look for whole and respectful relations between humans and other species. He interpreted the modern boundary between humans and nature that Mac had talked about as a site of developmental trauma. The ecological crisis then was the outworking of what he called private nightmares of incoherence and disorder in broken climaxes, where technologies in pursuit of mastery create ever worsening problems. Private nightmares expanded to a social level. It was a scathing and again bleak diagnosis, and the prognosis was simply poor. If increasing injury to the planet is a symptom of human psychopathology, wrote Shepard, is not the situation far worse than one of rational choices in an economic system, or the equilibration of competing vested interests? The Limits to Growth team sought to elicit just such rational choices from their readers for general survival. But for Shepard, the Western world was beset by an epidemic of the psychopathic mutilation of ontology. It had profound developmental problems. Westerners possessed the world's flimsiest identity structure, he said. Humans' efforts to carve themselves out from the planet had now rebounded upon themselves. Offering little hope for the global predicament, Shepard's writing found limited purchase, even somewhere like the Center for Psychology and Social Change. Instead, its researchers embraced thinkers and actors like Joanna Macy, who was a Buddhist scholar, systems theorist, and a deep ecologist. Since the 1970s, Macy had been running workshops to assist those stuck in despair or anxiety, initially at the prospect of nuclear annihilation, and later in the face of ecological catastrophe. Pain was at the center of the workshops because she said it was the point of connection between the experiences of suffering of humans and non-humans. Pain was planetary distress, registering deep in the human psyche. Macy developed the theory of the ecological self that had been suggested by her co-traveler in deep ecology, Arnie Naess. She drew also on the systems theory of Gregory Bateson and the work of the depth psychologist, Robert J. Lifton. Speaking at the Cambridge Centre in 1989, Macy argued that a new psychology, one capable of sustaining planetary life, would require a redefinition of the self. She led an experiential affective workshop at the centre also called Our Planet, Ourself, where participants recalled distant eons of planetary history, as well as grieving over recent losses, and came to envision a more than human future. The program was designed to expand participants' sense of time and space, and to work towards a substantive shift in identity to address that flimsy identity structure. This unbounded ecological self was the fulcrum of the new field of ecopsychology, which was a coin that began to flourish in the early 1990s. The meeting point as a field of deep ecology and psychology. Its practitioners and theorists would aim to resituate the limiting conditions for the human species from the biogeochemistry of Earth systems to the human psyche, from external limits to this internal boundary between self and other, psyche and planet. A cut, as Theodore Roja called it, between person and planet, a metaphor of violence, of course. For humans who continued in the stream of materialism, scientific or otherwise, and continued in extraction and combustion and wastage, their efforts would always end in ruin. Indeed, it was in the Holocene, the era of safety and felicity for the authors of the Planetary Boundaries framework, that cut had been made and allowed to quietly fester. Breaking down that boundary and healing that divide between selves and species was the only path then to a safe, stable biosphere. We think that a better world is possible, wrote the authors of Beyond the Limits in 1992, and that the acceptance of physical limits is the first step towards getting there. Easing down, managed reduction did not amount to a loss or a sacrifice, they said, but an opportunity to start battering against the Earth's limits and to start transcending self-imposed and unnecessary limits in human institutions and mindsets, beliefs, and ethics. This is what they meant by beyond the limits. The ideas of limits, they wrote, together with concepts like sustainability, sufficiency, equity, are not barriers, not obstacles, not threats. They are guides to a new world. These ideas carried Dana Meadows beyond the security and comfort of their expertise, as she told those who were gathered at Cambridge Hospital, to where science ends and the human psyche, culture, heart, and soul have to take over. She died in 2001, having completed the majority of the analysis and writing of a 30-year update for limits to growth. Published in 2004, the book reiterated the warnings of the first two books. The last decade, however, had revealed not only further movement into unsustainable territory, deforestation, topsoil erosion, rapid climate change, but the collapse of human projects seeking to prevent these things. The Earth Summit, that product of the work and thought of the Brundtland Commission, seemed to prove that global society had finally decided to deal seriously with the important environmental problems. But we now know that humanity failed to achieve the goals of Rio, they wrote in this published update. The second summit in Johannesburg in 2002, just before the book was written, had been almost paralyzed, they said, by ideological and economic conflicts, and by the pursuit of narrow individual and national, corporate, or individual self-interests. Of course, we're all too familiar with this failure of international mechanisms at the moment. Just as Meadows' talk at Cambridge Hospital gave her own perspective, the foreword to the 30-year update gave an insight into the perspectives of her co-authors and longtime collaborators, Jorgen Randers and Dennis Meadows, Dana's husband. We promised Dana before she died in early 2001 that we would complete the 30-year update of the book she loved so much, they wrote. Beyond the Limits had imagined, as I said, pessimism as the key obstacle to change. But now, as Dennis Meadows and Randers wrote in the months after Dana's death, they recalled that it was she who kept them from falling into pessimism themselves. We were once more reminded, they said, of the great differences among the hopes and expectations of the three authors. They continued, Dana was the unceasing optimist. She was a caring, compassionate believer in humanity. She predicated her entire life's work on the assumption that if she put enough of the right information in people's hands, they would ultimately go for the wise, the far-sighted, the humane solution. In this case, adopting the global policies that would avert overshoot, or failing that would ease the world back to the brink. Dana spent her life working for this ideal, they said. Jorgen was the cynic who felt that humanity would pursue short-term goals, ignoring the increasingly clear and strong signals until the bitter end. Whereas Dennis stood in the middle ground, seeing a relatively sustainable future emerge through the ashes of global crises. Arrayed as they were, they could find no common outlook for the future. Dana Meadows spoke of the arguments that preceded Beyond the Limits, especially the final chapter, with its awkward discussion of human values and love. The authors had come to an agreement, she said, but here her husband and Jorgen Randers called it Dana's hopeful concluding chapter, which held that if such strategies were persisted in, the world's people will increasingly choose the right way ahead out of love and respect for their planetary companions, current and future, human and non-human. The chapter was reproduced with minor alterations in this 30-year update. But for their part, Dennis Meadows and Randers retreated into the territory in which they felt comfortable. This was comprised of the data of physical science, the modeling of systems dynamics, but also the rationalist framework of limits and warnings and agency. The global task was to move the world back down into sustainable territory, they wrote, but it would take a long time to obtain political support for the changes in individual values and public policy that would achieve that. We do not know what Dana's hopes for the 30-year update were. Her surviving authors stated theirs plainly. Our main goal is to restate our 1972 argument in a way that is more understandable and better supported by all the data and examples that have emerged in the past decades. So it had been a failure of communication, not of analysis. We failed in our earlier books to convey this concern in a lucid manner, they said. The word choices are very interesting. Beyond the Limits had been stamped with Dana's optimism, as her husband and collaborator noted, but also with her experimentalism. The conditions of overshoot beyond the ecological limits of the Earth had allowed her to guide the team beyond the limits of lucidity and analysis. It was perhaps an abstract iteration of this notion of liminality, at the threshold of stability, of survival, of collapse, In the rarefied realm of computer simulations, as in the liminal space of a tour or a cruise, rules are relaxed, and there's room for new thoughts, emotions, expressions of identity. The early 1990s was a particular moment lodged between the horror of the earlier revelations of ecological crisis and the torpor of the later discourse. I've argued in this paper that the key move that constituted this moment was a willingness to go beyond scientific analysis, which revealed a set of external limits through ecological pain and anxiety, to examine the side of the internal limits separating modern selves from their planetary habitat. This consideration still lives in ecopsychology and deep ecology, in alternative movements that are willing to countenance this still radical vision of the human psyche as connected and embedded, sharing the pain of the systems and species of the planet. I've suggested that the Planetary Boundaries framework that was published 5 years after this 30-year update represented the same movement away from this opening moment, that it confined humanity between this social floor and ecological ceiling, a set of conditions of possibility woven into unyielding, limiting rings, demarcating a narrowing space of rational agency. Meadows and Randers intended to publish a 40-year update in 2012. They did not. But in an interview with Forum magazine that year, Meadows summarized his position. What we meant in 1972, he said, and what is still true, is that there is simply no endless physical growth on a finite planet. Past a certain point, growth ceases. For Meadows, what had been a future-oriented, hopeful project had become a historically inflected catalogue of failure. 40 years later, he told the magazine, "We regret to say we basically have not done anything." After he laid out the bleaker still state of the planet, all these years later, the magazine asked whether Meadows saw any solution. "This would change the nature of man," Meadows replied, in a throwback to Osborne. "We are basically now just as programmed as 10,000 years ago," he said. "If one of our ancestors could be attacked by a tiger, he also was not worried about the future, but his present survival. My concern is that for genetic reasons, we are just not able to deal with such things as long-term climate change. As long as we do not learn that, there is no way to solve all these problems. There's nothing we could do." 40 years after setting out on the Limits to Growth project, 20 years after reaching out beyond the limits, Dennis Meadows was recombining the metaphors and languages of limits. The boundaries between the human and other species had eroded, not to see selves and sentience in the more than human world, but to see the crushing action of ecological principles, of evolutionary time, on the human prospect. Humans were trapped by their nature. They were genetically incapable of expanding their visions to the scale and complexity of ecological crisis. There was no safe operating space for the human species, because there was no safe operating time for a species that had evolved just far enough to apply technology to support an exponential increase of their numbers and their burden on the planet, but just short of the threshold of vision and wisdom and love required to preserve it into the future. Proponents of the Anthropocene see the boundaries between humans and the planet, culture and nature, all dissolving in the disruption of the Earth systems. Damaging the life support systems for humans and other species creates a shared future, they say. But for Meadows, the lines would ultimately be drawn again around the human species, in the harshest and most final of terms. People always say, again, "We need to save our planet," he says. No, we do not. The planet is going to save itself. It always has done. Sometimes it took millions of years, but it happened. We should not be worried about the planet, but about the human species. And there the interview ends. Thanks for joining.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Can everyone give a Zoom digital round of applause for that talk? Thank you very much. So we have quite a bit of time now for questions. So we can either, I invite anyone to write them out in the chat, and I'm quite happy to relay them to Jamie. Or if you wish, you can raise your hand through the Zoom function, and I'll turn to you as well. While people might be thinking about questions, Jamie, thanks so much for a wonderful talk. was kind of really interested at the end, kind of your mention of evolutionary metaphors. And I was wondering, like a lot of the discussion and a lot of the I suppose a lot of the ideas have a kind of strong ecological bent, along with, systems thinking, I think, has an ecological kind of, metaphor itself. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the relationships between the use of those two metaphors, that kind of evolutionary genetic thinking about, what are the genetic settings of humans, and also the ideas about humans within a particular ecology and or a web of relationships. Is there a sense that those two are in tension at all throughout the discussions, in all of these limits to growth books?
I mean, intention is not my first response, or not what I've noticed in those discussions so much. I mean, there's a relationship, right? And human ecology as a field brings those two things together. Its knowledge and approach are drawn from evolutionary principles. It kind of understands the relations it sees in the world around it, and the kind of new relations which it's trying to discover and prove exist between humans and other species in quite intimate ways. It sees those as absolutely constituted by evolutionary relationships. And so it's always got this deep time basis for what it's doing. It has a lot of depth behind it. I think the tension might be in the kind of claims that are made, particularly about human behavior, the sort of evolutionary psychology, which is part of that field, and it's been an interesting interlocutor for these ideas all along, with the actual little more immediate experience of humans in the world. And so something like deep ecology is much more embodied, much more activist, much more intimate, in fact, whereas that kind of evolutionary approach, particularly when it comes to humans and how they act, can be, I think, just very stripped back and very almost cold in how it sees and describes humans. I don't see them in tension in very obvious direct ways. I think probably they have a different tendency. And part of that is about warmth and intimacy with other relations, other species. Human ecology, in fact, can often be, this is a very broad, strange field in a lot of ways, but it can be a very cold and material, it's got diagrams, it's about mapping resource flows and energy flows on them. And so it can be very cold in ways that these people that I'm writing about did find and would find very off-putting, very weak, a missed opportunity, perhaps.
It's interesting. I think, I didn't articulate my question very well, but, you're making me think here about how they operate differently as metaphors, as communicative metaphors. But I'll throw to Libby, I think, for another question.
Hi, Jamie. That was a fantastic rollicking ride through 50 years of history. It was great. There were two things that popped out at me. One was, I was really struck by your comments about Dana and the boys and their different psychological predispositions. And I wonder, it's very interesting that a lot of the rational cynicism is coming from men, and a lot of the hopeful positives are coming from women. And I see that in the art world too, that the artists who are painting the Anthropocene with a possible future for humans tend to be women, and the ones who are doing black holes of despair tend to be men. And so I'm just thinking that maybe this idea of a human condition is a boy's condition and not necessarily a human condition, and that there might be some space there for more different ways of being future. I mean, Val Plumwood was pretty cynical, and she was very, very feminist. I'm not saying all women are in this category or all men are in the negative category, but it is a resorting to the rational and not crying over your data is a boy's strategy. And the people who are writing about crying over their data now are people like Leslie Hughes, Joel Gerges. They are putting it right out there. They're still crying about their data. So there is, it's not actually a division between the rational and the emotional, but rather the people who can make them work together and the people who can't. And that's I just think it would be fun to, well, it'd be a lovely sort of image of Dana and the boys. And you could set up Jürgen Randers at the far end, and Dennis is pretty cynical too. I've actually met him, and yeah, but they're really insecure if they're not on their rational ground, if they're not back with their training, where I think the women have had to sort of improvise their education more, often had children or something on the way and interrupted it, and ended up with a slightly, they've had to use their psychology in order to be educated, where the men have perhaps gone down the straight and narrow way, and they haven't really let that piece out of their heads. It's just a thought. Human ecology also, I think, is not a uniform bubble, and I think it's really different in different eras in exactly the way psychology is. So I've done quite a bit of work with Stephen Boyden, who's still very Stephen's still sort of, a lot of his frameworks are coming out of the 60s because he's about 95 now, so it makes sense. But it's that the what trained them in the first place, and what optimism they have comes from that era, rather than necessarily from being so rational equals hopeful in the 1960s, where rational doesn't equal hopeful in the 1990s. And yeah. But there's one other ecological self person who's interesting, and that's Freya Matthews, our own philosopher. And she's also written a book called The Ecological Self. And she's a philosopher, not a psychologist. So that's kind of could be good to tweak in there somewhere. She's great too to talk
to. Thanks so much, Libby. All really interesting responses and suggestions. Thank you. It does make me think of a conversation I had the end of last year with a couple of eco-health people, Margot Parks and Pierre Horwitz. And interestingly, I mean, both of them talked about how little time they had. This is in the early 2000s when they're forming the field of eco-health, which is interestingly related to eco-psychology in different ways. But forming, and they've been surrounded by people who are in ecosystem health and all were doomists and alarmists, and would stand up there and just say that everything's going terribly, we're all going to die, and how little time they had. And it was Margot who voiced that, interestingly, and said, but there was an energy there that was in response to that, to say, we don't have time for that kind of approach. Everything's not doomed. We have what we have, and we're going to do transformative, relational, just work in the space and time that we have. I think the gender angle is, of course, very important. And so I think is the generational one, because in that framing, it was the old, white, powerful guys who were just being indulgent and just kind of interestingly performing feeling in a different way, I think. Performing feeling up on stages, but in an irresponsible and again, self-focused way, I think. Elegiac in all the wrong ways. And human ecology, absolutely, very different. It's an really interesting point about rationality, that what was rational in the 60s is no longer rational, or that the table has flipped. So I'm just saying, yes, absolutely, and thank you for your thoughts and suggestions.
You have a question here from Warwick Anderson, Jamie, who says, excellent talk. Can you say more about the concept of sustainability? Warden Borowoy suggests that Brundtland's report popularized the term, but can you find it in the 70s too? What sort of mindset or psychological attitude gives rise to a notion of sustainability? That is, does sustainability as a definite and explicit concept enter these psychological discourses too?
Yeah. For me, it's connected pretty strongly with the developmental discourse in the 80s. I'm not sure in the 70s. If I went back to some of these documents, I'm sure I'd find it. Yeah, and other people here might be more familiar with that territory. But there are certainly interesting psychological aspects, and it makes me think, your question makes me think of Glenn Albrecht, who, the Australian philosopher who for a time, 10 years or more, was a professor of sustainability. And then he's come to basically disavow the term. I'm thinking it's wrong-headed. It's an entirely human anthropocentric perspective. It's all about use value. It's connected with things like ecosystem services, which is an understandable, but at the same time, really toxic approach to the life of the planet, to say, let's parcel out and assess and enumerate the value in financial terms, economic terms, of ecosystems, of other forms of life. So sustainability is an interesting, but I think by now, somewhat abandoned term in certain ways. Not actually, it's obviously in certain circles, it's very much not abandoned, like the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a palatable term. Where I talked in the paper about words and approaches that were palatable, that could be accepted or not. And of course, sustainable development tries to do everything at once. I think there are fairly strong critiques of what it lacks as a framework, including certain more than human kinds of justice in its search for social equity. I see. Yes, the whole Sussex critique of limits to growth is a really interesting project. In fact, limits to growth, as I'm sure lots of people know here, is a massive project, a massive dialogue and discourse, which to kind of get to the bottom of here is a bit difficult to do. I really wanted to focus on that pivot away from that way of thinking in the early 90s and kind of describe it and show where it came from, as well as where it sort of ended up.
Thanks, Jamie. We might go to Steve Pascoe.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jamie, for a really stimulating and fascinating talk. There was so much in there. And I suppose the question I wanted to ask you perhaps dovetails and overlaps a bit with Warwick's question that you just addressed a moment ago. But I found your account of the shift between a language of limits to growth towards one of sustainable development following the Brundtland report really interesting. And I suppose I was wondering if you could tease that out a little bit more, because in light of the later regrets of Meadows et al., that they had not been successful in communicating the urgency of the task of moving away from ecologically damaging modes of production and so on. I wonder whether this shift in language around the late 80s, early 90s might have a lot to do with that, because it seems to me that in the shift from the paradigm of the limits to growth to sustainable development, that there was perhaps, as you argued, that it was motivated by a desire just to sidestep the problems of the limits to growth in political terms. But it seems that sustainability, as you were saying a moment ago, is so much more manipulable, open to greenwashing, etc., and becomes really a cover for continuing business as usual, with adding a few little marketing frills or something. But I'm wondering if you can see from your reading of this period, do you think were there other ways of articulating this change or getting away from the doom and gloom of the limits to growth that might have been available at that time, other than adopting sustainable development? And if so, what that might have looked like?
Well, I mean, I think eco-psychology and that internal cut that I was trying to describe between the individual self, the human soul or mind or spirit, and the planet and other forms of life. Obviously, that scale is difficult, but that was presented. I mean, not in exactly the same moment, but in a pretty small window of sustainable development is a global systems, global economics kind of approach to be able to, the government to be able to get behind and say, this is something that the global community can be doing and pursuing. You know, The nation state, I'm not sure how it could ever take up this idea of an internal cut and what that would look like. And I suppose it probably doesn't ever happen like that, that it's a, as Mac was trying to say, it's a transformation, a revolution that happens individually and then wells up. So I suppose that was the hope, the dream for someone like Meadows, or Mac or Macy, any of these people associated with eco-psychology, and it remains that. It's a small field that has continued on to present this alternative voice. But the fact that we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have the Masters of Sustainability here at the University of Sydney, and we have courses and programs and UN organizations built around sustainability, which don't have any countenance, don't have any imagination that might include or might be open to that key idea, I think, and to the more radical implications of that idea. You know, that it's much more relational than communal. It's much more difficult for a lot of people to accept, perhaps. So I suppose, as for what kind of policy programs or organizing principle there might be as an alternative to sustainability, I think it's that it's essentially eroding the boundaries between humans and other species. A kind of community. I mean, it's Aldo Leopold, really, a land ethic built around the idea of a community, where humans are part of the community and therefore implicated in the care and responsibility for it, for other kinds of life, for themselves, for the land itself. In a sense, it's not a new idea. It's built into Indigenous societies through all history and spaces, I think, in different forms. It's just radically departed from in Western societies. Modernity.
Yeah, I get the sense that you're talking about like a more than human version of sustainability, right? And to pick up on that, Mark Diesendorf says a strong definition of sustainable development is types of socioeconomic development that protect and restore the environment and social justice. It's a contestable concept like justice, freedom, and democracy, all can be manipulated by vested interests, but I suggest they are all worth struggling for, not abandoning, which I think kind of picked up there. Jamie?
Yeah. Look, abandoning was probably too strong a word. I think the problem, I suppose, with sustainable development, and even with the forming of the Frontline Commission, the way they formulated what they were talking about, is that it did seem to say we can do everything, we can have it all. And I suppose, you know, the cynicism of the Meadows, of Dennis Meadows, and of Jürgen Randers is not without substance. It's not without grounding. That we can't have it all, and that's not. I mean, it's been a damaging way to organize our response to an ecological crisis. The idea that we could do everything, that we could achieve full potential, whilst you know, preserving ecosystem services, or however we want to talk about them, for future generations and sharing them equitably among all peoples. There is nothing in our recent experience, I think, nothing in these models to suggest that we can do all these things. The Meadows and limits to growth, their hope was that there'll be a drawdown, a drawback, that the burden would grow smaller. So I suppose if we try and say that that's part of sustainable development goals, absolutely, sure. I guess the language doesn't point in that direction.
Warwick, is your question / comment still on this stream on sustainability?
Well, it's not, but I think those who haven't asked questions yet should take precedence. So I'm quite happy just to be at the back of the line.
I'll do that. So Amanda Wells picks up on Libby's points on gender and asks, you know, what might non-binary or gender non-conformist people bring to these approaches, as they might be well placed to navigate or illuminate the gendered aspects of these approaches.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think I left the gender element of that undiscussed for people to make of it what they would. I think, yeah, I mean, non-binary people might, and approaches and theoretical frameworks might be really interesting. You know, I mean, People will have heard of the Anthropocene, the fact that anthropos is, masculinized and rightly, and we need to get away from that whole language and framing. And more than just the framing, we need to get away from masculine approaches to these issues. Yeah.
And Paul Sanborn, this dates me, but I read Limits to Growth just before starting university in Canada in the mid-70s and still have my father's copy. But when I asked my students about this book, none of them have heard of it. Has it disappeared from general awareness everywhere else? And if it has, what accounts for this?
I can't speak for everywhere. I think it's still an important part of the of environmental history, the discursive kind of discussions around what we're doing. It's obviously very well known in all these kind of sustainability ways of approaching things. I don't think there's any reason why it should necessarily continue to be at the forefront of all these discussions, and perhaps that's why they didn't write their 40-year update. There are other things that have taken its place, I think. I guess it was a very influential and powerful moment that lasted from the 70s through to the early 21st century.
And now to you, Warwick.
Yeah, thanks. I had to laugh when people talked about being dated by Limits to Growth. It was the very first book I ever bought with my own money, first edition, when I was a teenager in the early 70s. And I still have it, actually, that was the original one. But anyhow, well, now for very old indeed. But Jamie, as you spoke, I mean, the gender issue is absolutely important, and I was impressed actually that for what is normally a white male story, the conventional story about all of this stuff, you do bring in Dana Meadows, and of course, as I said in the discussion, we could also bring in Barbara Ward and Marie Yehuda as well. And that's actually very refreshing. But one thing you don't do is think about the psychology in terms of white distinction. Because as you spoke, I was thinking of Ashish Nandi, my old friend Ashish Nandi. What would he be saying? And he would be saying, this is so typical of white people, that to think that they have a specially refined, complex, and very, very sensitive mental apparatus, unlike the lumpen psychology of the rest of the world. And to what extent, I mean, this is very cynical, maybe even a bit nasty of me to say this, but to what extent do you think this is partly a display, a performance of white psychological distinction, that we are so much more sensitive to the environment, especially white males, maybe especially white females actually. But anyhow, I'd just be interested in to what extent do you think this is a sort of cultivation of a particular form of white virtue?
I mean, I think perhaps, if anything, it's a cultivation of white shame, a cultivation of white grief, which can be similarly weaponized and mobilized, I think, for various reasons. The performance of those things. I mean, I genuinely think that these are people in the 70s and 80s, not just the theorists I'm mentioning, but the kind of the people that we're talking to and studying and clinically interacting with. Children who are frightened by nuclear war, but adults who are frightened by ecological ruination one way or another. And these are people who are genuinely disturbed and distressed. So I suppose there's always performative aspects in anything that we do, in any public stage we take. However, someone like Joanna Macy was working hard all through the 70s in a very under-exaggerated, unshowy way, unpretentious way, to help people through their distress. So the performative aspect might be something that needs to be helped through, perhaps. In general terms, I think I think absolutely that these things, and I wouldn't call it performative, and that's not the only thing to focus on here. It's then realizing their debilitations. So, you know, Paul Shepard, he talks in very crude, stark terms about the ways people are maimed, Westerners are maimed and mutilated psychologically. And so I don't think there's a lot of refinement on view on show there. I think also I'd like to probably say that it's always a critique of activists of any kind who declare themselves in any way, particularly their feelings and their emotions, that they're performing. An emotion is always at some level performed, but it's also legitimate and belongs in the public sphere as much as, you know, rational discourse. And so I think there's a really strong element of people who are distressed at planetary crisis and who are trying to do something with it, not only themselves, but something bigger to talk about changing things. Thanks for the question. It's a really interesting way to approach these things.
Well, it was meant as a provocative question, and I think you answered it very well. That yes, I mean, yeah, thanks.
How are we going with any other questions?
I'll leap in. Hello, everybody. And hi, Jamie, and thank you very much. And great to hear this. Back to gender again. I sat up a bit when you talked about our planet, ourselves, and wondered if that's got a connection to our bodies, ourselves, if any.
Not that I'm aware of, but it does sound very similar to that. Could you say a bit more about our bodies, ourselves?
So Our Bodies, Ourselves is a super famous text from, help me folks, 1972, I suppose. So a really foundational feminist text about women's health. Different discourse and different framing altogether. But the titles is, you know, it's very well known through the 1980s, perhaps less in the 1990s. But I just wondered, I mean, it's a, you know, if you copyrighted the title, you'd be making a claim for it after Our Planet, Ourselves. So, you know, given the genealogy of these people and that ecofeminism is one step away, if not part of all this, it just might be something to keep in mind in terms of knowingly or unknowingly, you know, duplicating another parallel activism, because the titles, yeah, thanks, Warwick, 1970. You know, this generation, there's no way they would be unaware of the famous text, Our Bodies, Ourselves.
Perhaps an interesting example of what the comment earlier was about generational change. It's not a text that I've grown up with in my study. And so, I mean, absolutely, and so missed in that. It seems like it probably is a direct reference to that, and I wouldn't be surprised because Macy is active in ecofeminism.
I mean, actually, just thinking about it now made me think. I've never read Our Bodies, Ourselves via the group and the network that you're talking about. So, you know, there's actually a question, given that health is the crossover here, or one of the crossovers, it'd be kind of interesting to go back to Our Bodies, Ourselves and look for the planet or environment. I've no idea off the top of my head whether it's in it, but anyway, I think it's an interesting connection in a moment.
Yeah.
Not least for you because selves is there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, very much so, and subjectivity as a key part of that movement, and then trying to mobilize subjectivity in a very different way in the late 80s, early 90s to try and be something which connects, not separates, connects with more than human selves.
Yeah.
Our Bodies, Ourselves was a self-help book too, rather than a manual for the world.
I was going to say it's an intriguing connection, but in fact, it is mostly about taking control of women taking control of women's bodies. And a lot of it has obviously to do with issues about reproductive rights and so on as well. Although, you know, that in itself is relevant, of course, the issue of reproduction, which was a great concern then and now. But it is an intriguing connection. And another one, actually, not only the sort of ecofeminism connection, which may not run through our bodies ourselves, but other through other routes, would be the what about eco-Marxism and the work of people like Murray Bookchin? And I just wonder whether there's been that aligns in any way with what you've said about eco-psychology.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of eco-Marxist version of eco-psychology?
There is actually. There's a strand of it, a critical strand of eco-psychology, which sees the whole thing as a bit too self-indulgent and individualized, and in the end doesn't achieve that social transformation that stops at individual transformation, if it ever gets there. So it's a kind of a radical, self-described radical strand of eco-psychology, which argues that it needs to be a kind of a political psychology as well, and needs to have a kind of a political critique. And so absolutely drawing on Bookchin and others. Yeah.
And Frantz Fanon, presumably, as well. Be interesting if Frantz Fanon gets into this discourse at all.
I'm trying to think about. I'm sure he does. I'm trying to think about it come across in this. Perhaps not.
Final call for questions, I think. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. This has been a really stimulating discussion. So thank you, everyone.
Super.
Thanks, everyone. Good comments.
I think one last round of applause for Jamie and his talk. Thank you all for your comments and your questions. And thank you, Jamie, for a terrific first seminar in this series.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you, everyone.
You're on mute, Jared.
Mute. Thank you. I'm on mute. Before we all go, our next talk is on the 22nd of February, and that will be Libby, who thankfully called me out for being on mute just then. 10 a.m, same time on the 22nd of February, World-Mindedness and the Local National Parks for the 1956 Melbourne Olympics. We look forward to that talk, and hopefully you can all join us again. Thanks once again, Jamie, and see you all again soon.
Thanks.